At the beginning, she doesn't feel the loss, at least not consciously. In fact, she may experience a sense of victory. The departure of someone who truly loved her is reinterpreted through the lens of ego as proof of her independence, her desirability, her power. She tells herself that you were replaceable, that your presence was convenient but not essential. And for a while, this illusion sustains her. It protects her from confronting a far more uncomfortable truth. But illusions, no matter how convincing, are fragile structures. They require constant reinforcement. And when the noise fades, when the attention she once relied on becomes inconsistent or shallow, something begins to shift. What she lost was not just another admirer or fleeting connection. It was someone who saw her beyond the surface, who offered stability instead of chaos, depth instead of performance. This is where the psychological tension begins, because genuine love, once experienced, leaves an imprint. It creates a reference point, and without it, everything else feels thinner, less real. The interactions that once fed her ego now fail to nourish her on a deeper level. She may not articulate it clearly, but she feels the absence, a kind of emotional hollowness that cannot be easily filled. And so the illusion starts to fracture, not all at once, but gradually, in quiet moments, in comparisons she didn't intend to make, in the growing awareness that what she dismissed so casually was, in fact, rare, something authentic that cannot simply be replaced by intensity or attention. This is the paradox. In trying to assert control, she loses the very thing that gave her emotional grounding. And when that realization begins to surface, it doesn't feel like defeat in the traditional sense. It feels like disorientation, because now she must confront not just the loss of you, but the collapse of the narrative she built to justify it. And the most unsettling part is this: the moment the illusion breaks is the moment she can no longer lie to herself about what she truly lost. What follows is not immediate collapse, but something far more subtle, and in many ways more disturbing. It is the emergence of silence, not the peaceful kind, but a psychological silence that begins to echo. Because when you were present, you didn't just occupy space, you filled it with attention, validation, emotional energy. You were, in many ways, a constant mirror, reflecting her sense of importance back to her. And now that mirror is gone. At first, she may try to replace it. New conversations, new faces, new sources of attention. But what she encounters is a critical difference. Attention is not the same as presence. It is scattered, inconsistent, often superficial. It lacks the depth that once anchored her. And this is where silence begins to take on a different quality. It is no longer just the absence of noise. It becomes the absence of meaning. In that silence, something uncomfortable starts to surface. Without someone consistently affirming her, she is left alone with her own thoughts, unfiltered, unvalidated, and often unkind. The external noise that once distracted her is no longer sufficient to drown out the internal dialogue. And for someone who relied heavily on external validation, this can feel deeply unsettling. This is the moment where psychological dependence reveals itself. Because the silence is not just about missing a person. It is about losing a source of emotional regulation. Without it, she may feel restless, anxious, even disoriented. The stillness forces reflection. But reflection is precisely what she has avoided. And so the silence grows louder. It follows her into quiet moments, into pauses between distractions, into the spaces where she can no longer escape herself. What once felt like freedom now begins to feel like isolation. Because the truth is, silence doesn't create discomfort. It exposes what was already there. And when a person can no longer escape that silence, They are left with only two choices: to confront themselves or to keep running from the very truth that could set them free. And then, almost without intention, comparison begins, not as a deliberate exercise, but as an unconscious process. Every new interaction, every new person she allows into her space is quietly measured against something she no longer has. This is not something she openly admits. Often, she isn't even fully aware of it, but the mind has a way of preserving what once felt real. Because genuine connection leaves a psychological imprint, it establishes a standard, a reference point that reshapes perception. What once seemed ordinary now reveals itself as meaningful, and what once felt exciting or stimulating begins to appear insufficient. She may encounter people who offer attention, charm, even intensity, but something is missing. The depth isn't there. The consistency isn't there. The sense of being understood beyond the surface level interaction is absent. And this absence becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. This is where a subtle but powerful realization starts to form. Not all attention is equal. There is a fundamental difference between being desired and being valued. One feeds the ego temporarily. The other nourishes something much deeper, something far more stable. And so the comparisons continue, not out of nostalgia, but out of contrast. She begins to notice how easily others lose interest, how quickly connections become transactional, how often interactions lack sincerity. What she once dismissed as replaceable now appears increasingly rare. This creates a quiet tension within her, because to fully acknowledge the difference is to admit that she misjudged something important. It requires her to confront the possibility that what she walked away from was not just another option, but perhaps the very thing she had been unconsciously seeking all along. And yet, the mind resists this conclusion. It tries to justify, to rationalize, to maintain the narrative of control. But reality has a way of asserting itself, not through force, but through repetition, through the undeniable pattern that keeps emerging. And eventually, the realization becomes unavoidable. When you lose something real, everything that follows doesn't just feel different, it feels less. Because once you've experienced depth, you can no longer be satisfied with the surface. At this stage, something even more complex begins to unfold. Beneath the surface, regret starts to take shape. But it does not arrive cleanly or honestly. It emerges quietly, often disguised as curiosity, restlessness, or a subtle pull toward the past. She may begin to revisit memories, not with the clarity of truth, but through fragments, moments where she felt understood, supported, grounded in a way she can no longer easily access. And yet, as this awareness begins to rise, it encounters resistance, because to fully feel regret requires something her psyche is not prepared to offer easily. Accountability. It would mean acknowledging that the loss was not accidental, but chosen, that what she now feels deprived of was once within her reach. And dismissed, this is where the internal conflict intensifies. On one side, there is the growing recognition that a mistake was made. On the other, there is the ego, defensive, protective, unwilling to relinquish its narrative of superiority and control. The ego does not apologize. It justifies. It reconstructs reality in a way that preserves self-image, even at the cost of truth. So she oscillates between these two states. In one moment, there is a quiet admission, perhaps fleeting, almost subconscious, that she lost something meaningful. In the next, that admission is quickly buried under rationalizations. It wouldn't have worked anyway. Or there are better options. These are not conclusions. They are defenses. But the deeper the regret, the harder it becomes to suppress. Because unlike surface emotions, genuine regret carries weight. It lingers. It returns uninvited. And each time it surfaces, it brings with it a clearer picture of what was lost, not idealized, but understood. This creates a kind of psychological friction that cannot be easily resolved. The longer it persists, the more exhausting it becomes to maintain the illusion. And eventually, the question is no longer whether regret exists, but whether she is willing to face it honestly. Because the truth is, growth only begins at the point where the ego is no longer in control. And until that moment arrives, regret will not disappear. It will simply wait quietly for the courage to be acknowledged. As this internal conflict continues, something begins to give way, not suddenly, but through gradual erosion. The image she has carefully constructed, the version of herself she presents to the world, starts to lose its stability. What once felt effortless now requires maintenance. And without a consistent source of validation to reinforce it, the mask becomes heavier to wear. Because that persona, the confident, detached, in control identity, was never entirely self sustained. It depended in subtle but significant ways on external reflection. It needed someone who believed in it, someone who reinforced it, even unconsciously. And when that presence is removed, the structure begins to weaken. At first, the cracks are small, moments of irritation that seem disproportionate, a growing impatience with others who fail to meet unspoken expectations, a sense of dissatisfaction that cannot be easily explained. But over time, these cracks widen. The emotional responses become less controlled, less calculated. The composure begins to slip. What is revealed underneath is not power, but vulnerability, often unacknowledged, often unexamined. Insecurity that was once hidden beneath confidence starts to surface. Frustration replaces certainty, and the carefully managed image becomes harder to maintain in the face of internal instability. This is not a transformation in the sense of growth, at least not yet. It is exposure. The removal of the protective layers that once concealed deeper truths. And without the presence of someone who offered genuine grounding, there is nothing to stabilize what emerges. This can lead to a kind of emotional volatility, because when a person is no longer able to rely on their constructed identity, they are left with the raw material of who they are beneath it. That confrontation is rarely comfortable. It challenges not only how they see themselves, but why they needed the mask in the first place. And so the question becomes unavoidable. Was the strength ever real, or was it simply supported by someone else's presence? Because when the mask falls, what remains is not what we pretend to be, but what we have the courage to face. And eventually, after the silence, the comparisons, the internal conflict, and the gradual unraveling of the persona, a shift occurs. It is subtle at first. A thought, a question, a quiet pull toward what was once familiar. The idea of returning begins to take shape, not necessarily out of clarity or transformation, but often out of discomfort, because what she is experiencing now lacks the depth she once knew, and the contrast has become impossible to ignore. So she may reach out, not always directly, not always honestly. It might come in the form of a message, a reaction, a small attempt to re-enter your awareness. On the surface, it can appear casual, even insignificant. But psychologically, it carries weight. It is an attempt to reconnect with a source that once provided stability, validity, and a sense of grounding she has been unable to replace. But here is where something fundamental has changed, not within her, but within you. Because the person who once tolerated, understood, and remain patient is no longer operating from the same place. Time, distance, and reflection have altered your perspective. You are no longer seeking what you once held on to. You have seen what happens when genuine effort is unrecognized, when depth is met with indifference. And that awareness creates a boundary that did not exist before. This is the moment where her expectation and reality no longer align. She may anticipate familiarity, access, or even influence, but what she encounters instead is distance, not out of bitterness, but out of growth. Because growth, when it is real, does not announce itself, it simply changes what you are willing to accept. And this is often the most difficult part for her to understand. Not the loss itself, but the permanence of it. The realization that the version of you she once knew is no longer available. That what she had access to was not guaranteed, but given, and once withdrawn, cannot be reclaimed in the same form. Because the truth is, some doors do not close out of anger. They close out of awareness. And once you truly see your value, you no longer return to places where it was once overlooked.